Hai, udah nonton Newsroom 63B edisi spesial Ramadan? Di situ kita bahas kenapa umat Islam pernah berjaya di bidang sains. Dan narasumber utamanya adalah Ahmed T, Kuru, penulis buku Islam, Otoritarianisme, dan Ketertinggalan. Kali ini kami akan menampilkan wawancara utuhnya untuk menggali lebih dalam sebenarnya apa sih akar krisis di dunia Islam. Sebelum lanjut, jangan lupa like, komen, dan subscribe YouTube Tirto, biar kamu gak ketinggalan obrolan asik sama tokoh-tokoh yang keren. Oke, selamat nonton!
We have to look at today in the world. Out of about 200 countries, a fourth of them, 49, are Muslim majority countries. And these Muslim majority countries have certain problems of authoritarianism and socioeconomic underdevelopment. And in terms of intellectual engagement, they also show certain level of difficulties. Why is that, and what explains these problems in Muslim majority countries? In Western academia and political circles, as well as many Middle Eastern countries, we see people blaming Islam. They say Islam is the reason for many problems in Muslim majority countries, and religion, in fact, should be blamed. I take this argument very seriously and show its weaknesses and problems in my book. And in particular aspect of the discussion is that between 8th to 12th centuries, Muslims were ahead of the rest of the world, including Western Europe, in terms of philosophy, in terms of science and economic development. Islam was perfectly compatible with intellectual and economic progress. And today, Muslim countries show variation. Indonesia, for example, is a democratic country with certain level of socioeconomic development, whereas there are other authoritarian underdeveloped Muslim countries. Therefore, just blaming religion is wrong. And Islam has been perfectly compatible on certain cases, especially in its golden age between 8th and 12th centuries with progress and development. In counter-argument, is to blame Western imperialism and to say that Western colonization is the sources of all problems. I take this argument seriously in my book as well, but also show its problems. Because chronologically, when Western colonization began in around 18th century, Muslim majority societies already had intellectual and economic stagnation. So the problems began before colonization. Additionally, if you only focus the foreign attacks, invasions, colonizations, you miss internal problems. So Muslims, in order to solve their problems, have to focus on their domestic issues and how to deal with the problems in their own institutions and ideas. So that's the really problematic aspect of just focusing on colonization. My own argument is look at the relationship between four different classes: religious class, political class, intellectual class, and economic class. In Muslims' golden age between 8th and 12th centuries, there were very dynamic and productive intellectual class, both religious scholars like Abu Hanifa and philosophers like Ibn Sina, Farabi, Ibn Haytham. And these intellectuals, scholars contributed science. They developed certain mathematical formulas like algorithms, algebra, and other tools. And zero and other numerals were developed by Muslims. They learned from India, taught to Western Europe. In addition to that, Muslims also had very dynamic merchant class that you can call bourgeoisie. This merchant class innovated certain things that we use today in Western countries, like check and certain elements of the banking system. But in the mid-11th century, this class relation started to change. The ulama class, that it basically means Islamic scholars studying Islamic sciences, and we call alim as singular and ulama in plural. This ulama class between 7th and 11th centuries were mostly independent from state bureaucracy. But in the 11th century, a multi-level transformation began. Economically, Muslims' economies moved from monetary market economy to semi-feudal iqta system where the state controlled lands, land revenue distribution, and economy in general. Politically, the state structure became more and more militarized. Military states and empires like the Ghaznavi in northern India, the Seljuks in Central Asia, brought a new emphasis on conquest and military emphasis on the state structure. In addition to this economic and political/military change, there was also a religious change. In the mid-11th century, Abbasi caliphs, Qadir and Qaim, father and son, declared a Sunni creed. They announced that Mu'tazili, rationalist Muslim philosophers, were infidel. Certain Shias, especially Ismaili Shias, are infidel. And non-practicing Muslims who do not pray 5 times a day are infidel. And this declaration meant the establishment of a Sunni orthodoxy. It was a reaction to Shia dynasties and political authorities that started to rule Egypt by the Fatimi dynasty, certain parts of Arabian Peninsula by Karmatis, northern Syria, and even Iraq itself by Hamdanis and Buyuts. The call by Abbasi caliphs to unify Sunnis under a Sunni Orthodox creed was well received by the Seljuk Empire. The Seljuk nomadic warriors came to Baghdad, established a Sunni rule in Baghdad, and they used the iqta system to control economy and distribute lands in military commanders. And their prime minister, Nizam al-Mulk, started to establish a madrasa system. So with this new Sunni orthodoxy plus military empire, the merchant class became marginalized. They no longer support the scholars, and the scholars started to be supported by the state, especially the madrasa system called Nizamiya madrasas. And an important genius, Ghazali, also helped the establishment of this new system. He wrote books attacking philosophers like Tehafet al-Falasefe, his famous book, also attacking certain Shias. And Ghazali, of course, is a very complex figure. And I like his books, but one aspect of his legacy was very anti-intellectual. At the end of his book, Tehafet al-Falasefe, Ghazali asked a hypothetical question. Are the philosophers, or can the philosophers be declared apostates and their followers can be punished by death? And he says yes, for 3 reasons. 1, philosophers like Farabi, Ibn Sina, and others claim that the world is eternal, the material universe is eternal. 2nd, the resurrection will be spiritual, not with human bodies. 3rd, God knows the macro big things, but doesn't care about the details. So because of these 3 claims, according to Ghazali and his understanding of philosophy, the philosophers are apostates. And after that time, the Sunni Orthodoxy used Ghazali's and other ulama's fatwas to punish philosophers, to declare them apostates, and it became a tool for political oppression to punish the dissenting views, opposition, and became a pejorative term. People start afraid of being called as philosophers after 12th, 13th centuries. And an anti-intellectual emphasis came all the way until today. So of course, there have been many transformations and changes, but after the mid-11th century, what I call ulama-state alliance was established. Ulama became part of the state in alliance with military state. There emerged a reaction to philosophers and other intellectuals. And being a philosopher, being an intellectual started to mean not religious enough, not a good Muslim. And until today, this emphasis really makes intellectual life very stagnant in the Muslim world. And that's how we reach many problems today. So before the 11th century, in fact, when we compare the Muslim world and Western Europe, we see that in Western Europe, the Catholic clergy and the military aristocracy dominated public life. There was no merchant class, no intellectual class comparable what Muslims had in Western Europe. That's why Western Europe was economically and intellectually was very weak and stagnant between the 6th and 11th centuries. Whereas in the Muslim world, there was almost the opposite political and religious conditions. Muslim scholars, ulama, at that time put a distance between themselves and the political authorities. Why and how? Because after Prophet Muhammad and the four caliphs had a personal and charismatic and religious authority, the first state builder in Islamic history was Muawiyah, the founder of Umayyad dynasty. And the Umayyad dynasty was established based on the persecution of Prophet's family members and including the killing of Hussein, Prophet's grandson. That's why Shias totally delegitimized Umayyad dynasty, and Sunnis religiously delegitimize Umayyad rulers. And most Umayyad rulers were happy with it. They defined themselves as like kings. And Muawiyah, in fact, in Islamic history, was the first who used a crown, a throne, and a bodyguard as symbols of state. So for him, raison d'etat, the meaning and purpose of state, was very important. So therefore, we see the separation between religious authority and political authority. Umayyads were regarded political rulers. And since they persecute Prophet's family members, it gave the message to ulama that political rulers, emirs, kings, sultans were corrupt, immoral, and ulama should avoid direct connection with them. Under the Abbasids, with certain differences, the same trend continues. As we see that today, there are four main Sunni Mazhab Islamic law schools: Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi, Hanbal. All three of the founders were persecuted by the state authorities. Abu Hanifa was a Sikh merchant, and he was asked to be the judge by Abbasi Caliph. He refused. Then the Caliph said, "Give me a reason for that." Abu Hanifa famously said, "I am not qualified." Then the Caliph was angry and he said, "You are a liar." Then Abu Hanifa said, "A liar can never be a judge." Then this outraged Caliph put him in prison, and Abu Hanifa was poisoned to death. Malik was tortured and beaten. Shafi was arrested and persecuted. Ibn Hanbal was imprisoned and sentenced to death. He barely escaped the death sentence. And Ibn Hanbal and many others declared that it is haram, impermissible, for a Muslim scholar to receive money from the state. So that really creates a diversity, diverse religious views, diverse philosophical views. Under the Umayyad and Abbasids, the state rulers had limited chance to sacralize their authority. They never claimed a divine position for them, unlike Europe, where kings claimed to be divine and rule on behalf of God until the 11th century. But the 11th century was a major transformation point for both. In Western Europe, from the mid-11th to mid-12th centuries, the popes tried to dominate politics, kings tried to dominate Vatican, both failed, and they institutionalized certain level of church-state separation that we know today. Historically, it emerged in the 11th century. In Islam and Islamic history, the reverse happened in the mid-11th century. After 4 or 5 centuries of separation between religious and political authorities, what I call ulama-state alliance emerged because of economic, political, religious transformations under the Selçuk Empire, with the Selçuk military authority, with the Abbasi Caliph's Sunni Orthodoxy, with Nizam al-Mulk, who established Nizamiye Madrasa chain, and with Ghazali, a very important scholar who became the architect of ulama-state alliance. But even Ghazali himself, the architect of ulama-state alliance, had many up and down, zigzags, inconsistencies during his life. At the age of 40, he regretted what he had done. He went to mausoleum of Prophet Abraham and took an oath that he would never do 3 things, that he would never receive money from rulers, he would never join to the debates in the places, palaces of the ruling class, and he would never teach again state-funded Nizamiye madrasas. So even Ghazali knew and remembered that he should have put a distance between state authorities and religion. So until today, this ulama-state alliance continue. And today, if you ask people about Islam and Christianity, many people would tell you that there is no separation between religion and state in Islam, but there is always a separation between religion and state in Christianity. It's wrong. Until the 11th century, there was a separation in Islam, but not Christianity. Things change after the 11th century for many historical reasons I try to summarize. After the Selçuk Empire established what I call ulama-state alliance, ulama's alliance with particularly military state, this model was emulated and repeated by the upcoming dynasties and empires. So Selçuks from the mid-11th to mid-12th centuries established this model of ulama-state alliance with the state control of land revenues, with the military state mentality, with Sunni orthodoxy in Central Asia, Iran, and Iraq. But after the mid-12th century, in western part of the Muslim world, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, there was the challenge of Crusaders, and in the east, there was the challenge of the Mongols. When Muslims experienced the massacres and killings and invasions of Mongols and Crusaders, they sought refuge from military heroes. Because when you see massacres, you can look after good music, arts, and science. You want to survive with a military hero. And the military hero came in the form of Saladin. And Saladin defeated the Crusaders. Saladin established the Ayyubi dynasty. Then the Ayyubi dynasty gave birth to Mamluk dynasty, the Mamluk military oligarchy in Syria and Egypt. And Saladin, Ayyubis, and Mamluks institutionalized ulama state alliance in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt in the 12th and 13th centuries. And this is how this model moved from Central Asia all the way to North Africa. And later on, after the Crusaders and Mongol invasions, Muslims recovered militarily and politically. They established three major empires: Ottoman, Safavi, and Mughal empires. Ottomans in today's Middle East and Balkans, Safavis in Iran, and Mughals in entire subcontinent, including India. These three empires showed that Muslims once again became militarily, politically very powerful. But they never recovered intellectually and to some extent economically, because all three of these empires were ruled by ulama state alliance. They were military empire. When Europe experienced the rise of bourgeois class and intellectuals, Muslims didn't have dynamic bourgeois class and intellectuals. When Europe had Renaissance, Reformation, printing revolution, scientific revolution, enlightenment, industrial revolution, they used many tools, especially three of them: gunpowder, nautical compass, and printing press. But these three Muslim empires only pick gunpowder out of the three because they were ruled by military, and military commanders knew the importance of gunpowder. They didn't care much about nautical compass because other than the Ottomans, none of them had a major navy. And most importantly, these empires did not get printing press. First of the three was the Ottoman Empire, which received the printing technology about 300 years after Europe. That's why in the 18th century, when Ottomans printed only 50,000 books, Western Europe in the same century printed 1 billion books. And when in the early 19th century, the estimate Ottoman literacy rate was around 1%, in Europe at the time, around 1800, the estimate literacy rate was 31%. And this problem continues that even today, there is a gap between literacy and schooling and education in the Muslim world with literacy, schooling, and education in Western Europe. That's how the military empires really became intellectually and scientifically backward because of the ulama state alliance and how it marginalized intellectuals and the merchants. So when we look at the example of Abu Hanifa and other early scholars, how they stood against political demands and oppression and became model about the independence of Islamic sciences from state authority, it's really surprising today to see that in many Muslim majority countries, state-controlled mosques, state-controlled religious schooling and religious teaching. In Turkey, for example, there are about 100,000 mosques. All of them are under state control. And every Friday, the imams in mosques recite the sermon from a standard text designed by a government agency without independence for imam to teach what they really believe, what is the true message. Similarly, in Egypt, majority of mosques are under state control. The Sheikh of Al-Azhar, the president of Al-Azhar University and the religious school, is a political nominee. The president of Egypt decide who would be the head of LSR. And in Pakistan and elsewhere, there is either direct state control over religious authorities or an alliance between them. And in Iran, mullahs are at the top with the supreme leader, guardian council, etc. This really has had negative impacts on both the ulama and religion itself, because religion became a tool for political purposes, and it minimized the chances of democratization, because when the religious class glorify and sacralize politicians, it becomes very difficult to criticize politicians, because then you are blamed to be not a good Muslim and blamed to be an apostate or blasphemous person. So in order to solve this problem, we have to see its origin. Today, Islamists and those who hate Islam in Western academia, we call them Islamophobes, they agree on the idea that there is no separation between religion and state in Islam. If you ask them, what is your source about? They say there is a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that he says, religion and state are twins. Religion is the foundation, state is the guardian. That without guardian perishes, that without foundation collapses. So in my book, I analyzed this proverb and maxim, and then find out, as several other scholars already mentioned, that this is a Sasanian idea, nothing to do with the Prophet. It was said by the founding king of Sasani Empire, Ardashir, 300 years before the Prophet. But after the mid-11th century, when ulama wants to justify ulama-state alliance, they fabricated this hadith, which is not a hadith, a Sasani maxim, as a prophet saying. And since that time, they keep saying that, and many people believe that in Islam, state and religion are twins, which is not. And they searched for more justification, but couldn't find anything in the Quran. And Ibn Taymiyyah, an important 14th century scholar in Egypt under the Mamluk rule, interpret a very important phrase in the Quran, ulul amri minkum, asking Muslims to obey those who have authority among you. So the verse doesn't refer to ulama or the state, but Ibn Taymiyyah argues that it asks Muslims to obey the umara and the ulama. Umara basically is the state and ulama is the ulama. So what I call ulama-state alliance, since Ibn Taymiyyah at least until now, is regarded as an Quranic order. That's why it becomes really difficult to challenge, and Muslim masses believe in that. But in reality, the Quran doesn't say anything about it. It's just an interpretation. The hadith, so-called, is a fabrication. And even as I said, the architect of this ulama-state alliance, Ghazali, if you read his Ihya Ulumuddin multi-volume book, he in fact asked Muslims to be cautious against despots, against corrupt rulers. Therefore, I think it is not a really liberal Western agenda to ask separation between religion and state. It is really respectful to Islamic teaching and Islamic golden age between 6th and 12th centuries. And if Abu Hanifa and many other early scholars live today, they would have surprised to see how the religious authorities became state servant. When we compare the early Islamic history with today, we see a major difference, because according to Cohen's article in 1970, where he analyzed 3,900 Islamic scholars between 8th and mid-11th century. 92% of them were in the private sector. Only 8% were in the state sector, working as judge or prosecutor or in other official positions. If you look at today, in countries like Turkey, Egypt, and many others, you see the reverse. 90% or so of the ulama are paid by the state. 10% or so minority are privately funded. And this reversal explains many things about the power relations, about the intellectual stagnation. In Turkey, for example, all imams in mosques are paid, their salaries are paid by the government. So they are government officers. And if you are government officials, how can you criticize the government? You always justify, you always give a reasoning at whatever government does. In Egypt, when Nasser established the republic in 1950s, he wanted to challenge the Muslim Brothers by using LSR and other Islamic institutions and make them part of the Egyptian state. And in Pakistan, Zia-ul-Haq established alliances with ulama in passing, for example, the blasphemy laws. Before Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, there was a blasphemy law, but the sentence was very limited, and Zia-ul-Haq brought it death sentence for the blasphemy in alliance with the ulama. As you see, in Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, and definitely in Iran, the combination of state power and the ulama restrict the possibilities of democracy and impose many restrictions such as blasphemy laws and other illiberal policies. So the world now faces multiple crises, from pandemic to right-wing populism. What would the Muslim world do in the near future? There has been a discussion about the Muslim Renaissance and what is the model for them. So where I grew up in Turkey, there has been a discussion whether the Westernization policies is the key solution or going back to Ottoman model. And now, today, thanks to Turkish soap operas and TV series, the Ottoman model is now popular in Pakistan and many other countries who watch the Turkish series about Ottomans. But in fact, when Muslims really want freedom and democratization, when they want development and socioeconomic progress, the way is to reform ideas, institutions. Just going back to military history is not the solution, it's a problem. And in the Ottoman Empire, yes, for 600 years, they really achieved certain level of political and military expansion. But scientifically and philosophically, it was an era of overall stagnation. In my book, I give details of the Ottoman history, how geopolitically they were successful, and how they had certain periods of even philosophical productivity. But the overall trend was an intellectual stagnation. And today, if Muslims really want to achieve democratization and socioeconomic development, what they need to do is to establish open societies, meritocratic systems, and competitive economies. We need separation of spheres. It is not only separation of religious and political authorities, but also separation of politics, religion, science, economy, art, sports, and all spheres from each other. Each of them should be autonomous, should be ruled by its own criteria. If we mixed religion, politics, economy, science, all of them, the result is corruption. If a professor judge based on religion, he is a corrupt professor. If a professor judge based on money, he is not a good teacher. The professor should judge his students academically. Same thing for a religious leader. He should follow what is religious, the truth. Mixing religion, politics, economy is a major problem. So when people like myself come and argue and ask Muslims to establish democratic, open societies, meritocratic, competitive systems, a major criticism to us is that we are bringing American Western agenda. It's wrong, because what we try to promote as democracy and development is perfectly compatible with Islam and Prophet's message, and it's really compatible with early Islamic history. From 8th to 12th centuries, Muslims established societies much more open than Western European societies. Muslim, Christian, Jews, agnostics worked together in between 8th and 12th centuries, whereas in Western Europe, a non-Christian had no chance to live other than persecuted Jewish minority in Europe. As a result, Muslims had dynamic societies, major cities, cutting-edge philosophers, scientists, economic development. So once again, we really need being open-minded, diverse, creative, competitive, tolerant. Orthodoxy destroying heterodoxy is the wrong way. And once Muslim really had to choose between either a progressive path or just preserving tradition, they should remember that their own tradition, their own history is full of insight and examples. In order to establish democratic societies and meritocratic systems, Muslims do not simply need to imitate Western models. If they know their history, if they know their achievements between 8th and 12th centuries, that's the inspiration for them. And that's the way to have a Muslim Renaissance today.